began on October 5th, a date that will likely be scrutinised by historians for decades to come. That was the day the public data stream for Object 3I Atlas suddenly froze. For 45 days, the most advanced sensors on Earth seemed to go blind. Not to the entire universe, because the satellites still tracked hurricanes and the telescopes still mapped distant galaxies, but specifically to this one incoming visitor, the feed was cut. We were told it was a government shutdown, a bureaucratic stall in Washington that prevented the processing of new images. It was a mundane explanation designed to be boring enough to accept without question. But those of us watching the raw telemetry noticed a disturbing contradiction that the official press releases failed to address. While the files for 3I Atlas were locked behind a wall of silence supposedly due to a lack of funding or personnel, the high-rise camera orbiting Mars continued to upload crystal-clear high-resolution photos of the Martian surface every single day. Gigabytes of data flowed freely from the red planet across the deep space network. Yet a simple string of coordinates for an object approaching Earth was deemed too difficult to process. The shutdown was selective. The blackout was targeted. For a month and a half, the astronomical community waited in a vacuum of information, while the object drew closer to Earth at 30 kilometers per second. Amateur astronomers scanning the skies from Chile to Australia pointed their backyard telescopes at the predicted coordinates, but without the massive aperture of the Webb or Hubble telescopes, or the deep space radar of the Goldstone Array, the object remained a ghost, a faint shadow moving against the backdrop of stars visible only as a dip in the light curve. This was not just a delay in paperwork, it felt like a quarantine. During this digital darkness, rumours began to circulate in the back channels of the scientific community. On secure forums and encrypted chats, whispers emerged suggesting that the initial spectral analysis before the cutoff had returned data that made no sense. There were leaks suggesting the object was too bright for its size, implying a metallic surface that reflected radar like a mirror, that it was moving too fast for a passive rock caught in gravity, and that it was spinning with a mechanical precision that nature rarely, if ever, produces. The official narrative was that the team was simply locked out of their computers, but the reality felt much more like a panic room where decisions were being made on how to explain the unexplainable. Imagine the scene inside those control rooms. The realization that the object wasn't behaving according to Kepler's laws, the desperate checks for sensor error, and then the phone call to classify the data. We're used to waiting for science. Peer review takes time, data processing takes time, but we are not used to being blinded in real time. And as the days turned into weeks, the silence became a signal in itself. It suggested that the agency wasn't struggling to process the image physically, but rather struggling to process the ontological implications of what they were seeing. When the lights finally came back on, we expected a simple photo of a dirty snowball to put the rumours to rest. Instead, we got a blurry grey smear and a story that didn't add up. But by then it was too late to hide the truth because the raw data had already begun to leak, and what it revealed was not a comet. The numbers that eventually broke the silence were not chemical, they were geometric. When the telemetry for 3I Atlas finally flooded the servers, astronomers realized they were looking at a trajectory that defied the laws of chance. In the chaotic shooting gallery of the galaxy, interstellar objects are supposed to arrive like stones thrown through a window. They fall from above the galactic plane or dive from below, coming from random constellations at wild, unpredictable angles. Oumuamua dropped in from the direction of Vega, almost perpendicular to our system. Borisov came from Cassiopeia, slicing through at a steep incline. But 3I Atlas did something that sent a chill through the control rooms. It arrived flat. It did not plunge from the chaotic void, but rather slid perfectly into the ecliptic plane, the thin invisible disk where Earth and all the other planets orbit the Sun. To understand the impossibility of this, you have to understand the scale of the target. The solar system is a vast sphere of empty space extending billions of kilometers in every direction, but the ecliptic is just a razor-thin line within that sphere. For a random rock wandering the galaxy for billions of years to accidentally hit that specific orbital corridor is a statistical absurdity. The calculated odds are less than 1 in 500. Yet 3I Atlas threaded that needle with the precision of a guided missile. NASA administrators called it a stroke of luck. They celebrated the fact that this alignment allowed our telescopes to maintain a constant, uninterrupted view of the object without the Earth blocking the line of sight. But this optimism glossed over the terrifying implication of that convenience. In the world of ballistics, luck is often just a euphemism for a good aim. By entering along the planetary plane, the object maximised its visibility to us, while simultaneously maximising its access to the inner planets. It was behaving less like a piece of debris caught in a gravity well, and more like a vessel entering a harbour. This trajectory allowed it to skim past the major planets without being ejected by Jupiter's massive gravity field, a navigational feat that requires either impossible fortune or deliberate calculation. Nature is messy. Nature throws rocks in all directions. Explosions are spherical and chaotic. But intelligence draws straight lines. Intelligence seeks efficiency. As the orbital diagrams were drawn and redrawn, the skepticism began to mutate into a quiet dread. We were watching a visitor that knew exactly how to walk through our front door without tripping the alarm. The official reports focused on where it was going, but they ignored the unsettling precision of how it got here. If you throw a dart at a map and hit a city, it is an accident. But if you throw a dart and hit the exact centre of the street where the sensors are watching you, that is a message. The geometry of 3I Atlas was not an accident of celestial mechanics. It was the first clear sign that we were dealing with something that understood the layout of our home better than a random rock ever could. It didn't just fall into our system blindly drifting through the dark. Looking at that perfect flat line on the monitor, one realization became impossible to ignore. It looks like it aimed for us. On October 22nd, the spectroscopic data from the Maven spacecraft finally hit the servers and immediately triggered a quiet panic in the analysis room that no one dared to voice aloud. Until that moment, the working theory was that 3I Atlas was a rogue comet ejected from a distant star system, a natural wanderer made of ice and primitive rock. But the chemical signature flashing on the monitors told a completely different and scientifically impossible story. To understand why this data was so terrifying, you have to understand how the universe builds matter in the nuclear furnaces of stars. Iron and nickel are the cosmic twins of stellar evolution. They are forged together in the hearts of dying stars and exploded out into the galaxy in massive supernovae, mixing together in the dust clouds that form new solar systems. In every single asteroid, comet and meteorite ever studied by human science, these two elements are found together like salt and pepper. They are inseparable partners bound by the laws of nucleosynthesis. You might find an iron meteorite with some nickel or a nickel-rich rock with plenty of iron, but you never find one without the other. Yet the spectral lines for 3I Atlas showed a composition that shouldn't exist in a natural universe. The object was screaming with the signature of pure nickel, but the line for iron was completely flat. It was a ghost element. The ratio was so extreme that it defied every model of planetary formation we possess. In nature, there is no known process that can sift through a mountain of rock and extract the nickel while discarding every single atom of iron. Gravity cannot do it because their atomic weights are too similar. Heat cannot do it because their melting points are too close. Collision cannot do it. There is only one place in the universe where we see nickel separated from iron with this kind of purity. A refinery. This was the moment the narrative began to fracture for the scientists involved. Looking at those charts, they realized they were not looking at a geological sample formed by gravity and time. They were looking at a product formed by intent and engineering. Industrial alloys used in advanced aerospace engineering often require high-purity nickel for heat shielding and structural integrity. It is a material chosen specifically for its ability to survive extreme temperatures and radiation without warping. Finding a 5-kilometer wide slab of this material floating in deep space is like finding a perfectly refined steel beam on a deserted beach. It implies a builder. The official report buried this anomaly in a footnote describing the composition as unusual, but likely due to unknown exotic origins. But exotic is just a polite word for artificial. The silence from the astronomical community wasn't because they didn't understand the data, it was because they understood it too well. If nature didn't remove the iron, then something else did. And if 3I Atlas was composed of refined shielding material rather than primitive rock, then its arrival in our system was not a random drift. It was a deployment. As the object drew closer, the spectral analysis continued to scream its impossible truth at anyone willing to listen. We were not looking at a dirty snowball melting in the sun. We were looking at a hull. and as the heat of the sun began to rise, another anomaly was about to emerge that would make the missing iron seem like a minor detail. On November the 2nd, the dimensional analysis shattered the last remnants of the comet theory, and replaced it with a sense of scale that was truly disturbing. While the public was still digesting the blurry images released by the agencies, the mathematicians were looking at the gravitational perturbations and realizing something terrifying about the mass of 3I Atlas. This was not a piece of cosmic drift. It was a leviathan. The initial reports tried to downplay its size, suggesting it was a standard cometary fragment, perhaps a few hundred meters across, similar to the innocuous rocks that pass us by every year. But the mass calculations told a different story. Based on how it resisted the solar wind and held its trajectory against the pressure of the sun, the object had to be dense and it had to be massive. We're talking about a structure at least 5 kilometers in diameter. To put that in perspective, Oumuamua, the first interstellar visitor, was a sliver of rock roughly the size of a football field. 3I Atlas is 1,000,000 times more massive than Oumuamua. It is 1,000 times heavier than the typical comets that wander our system. It is a flying mountain larger than downtown Manhattan, moving at speeds that defy comprehension. When an object this large enters the solar system, it usually announces itself with a brilliant tail of sublimating gas, a coma that lights up the sky like a second moon. But 3I Atlas remained stubbornly dim. This is the paradox of the 5-kilometer shadow. An object of this immense size, composed of ice and rock, should reflect sunlight like a beacon, especially when passing inside the orbit of Mars. Instead, it absorbed it. The data suggests an albedo so low that it rivals the darkest materials ever created in a lab like Vantablack. It is matte black, a void moving through the glare. This lack of reflectivity is not a natural trait for a comet, which is essentially a dirty snowball that brightens and sparkles as it melts. A 5-kilometer snowball near the sun should be visible to the naked eye from Earth. The fact that it wasn't suggests that the surface is not ice but something designed to minimize detection, something engineered to scatter radar and absorb visible light like the stealth coating on a bomber. This brings us back to the disturbing silence from the space agencies. They knew the size, they knew the mass, they knew that a natural object of this scale does not hide in the dark, yet they continued to use the word comet in every press release, calling 3I Atlas. A comet is like calling an aircraft carrier a driftwood log just because they both float. It is a deliberate oversimplification designed to prevent panic. Because if the public understood that a 5-kilometer wide dark object was maneuvering through the ecliptic plane, the questions would shift from scientific curiosity to existential dread. We are not dealing with a rock, we are dealing with a carrier. A structure massive enough to house internal systems, massive enough to shield itself from the sun, and massive enough to ignore the gravitational nudges that send smaller rocks tumbling into chaos. And the most chilling part of this realization is its position. It is hiding in the one place where our telescopes differ the most. The glare of the sun. It is using our own star as visual cover, moving in the blind spot of our planetary defenses. A tactic that implies not just existence but strategy. And as the astronomers strained to track this dark giant against the burning backdrop of the solar corona, they noticed something else. It wasn't just big and it wasn't just dark. It was keeping time. On November the 8th, the light curve data flattened into a rhythm that was too perfect to be natural. While NASA remained silent, a network of amateur astronomers across the southern hemisphere began to notice a heartbeat in the static, a precise 16-hour dimming cycle that did not deviate by a single second. To the uninitiated, a spinning rock sounds like the most mundane thing in the universe, but to anyone who understands orbital mechanics, this consistency was a red alert. Comets are by definition chaotic entities, especially when they approach the perihelion of a star. As they heat up, the uneven melting of ice causes jets of gas to erupt from the surface, creating massive amounts of unpredictable torque. Imagine a child's spinning top being hit by a fire hose. It should wobble. It should tumble. Its rotation period should fluctuate wildly as it loses mass and shifts its center of gravity. This phenomenon is known in astrophysics as the Yarkovsky effect, and it is the fingerprint of a natural object dying in the solar glare. But 3I Atlas ignored the fire hose. Despite being battered by solar winds and subjected to immense tidal forces that should have stretched and twisted its rotation, It maintained a rigid mechanical lock on its cycle. It was spinning with the unwavering discipline of a military gyroscope. This implies an internal density distribution that is mathematically perfect, balanced down to the gram. Or it implies active stabilization, a system designed to correct for drift and maintain a specific orientation relative to the stars, perhaps to keep a shield facing the sun or a sensor facing the Earth. Nature does not build watches, nature builds avalanches. If you throw a mountain into a gravity well, it does not spin like a centrifuge unless it was designed to do so. The amateur observers logged the data on public forums, their excitement slowly turning into unease as the pattern refused to break. 16 hours on the dot. 16 hours. 16 hours. It felt less like a rotation and more like a program, a machine running a diagnostic loop. The silence from the professional observatories became deafening in the face of this symmetry. They knew that a natural object 5 kilometers wide should be tumbling chaotically under these conditions. By refusing to address the stability of the spin, they were tacitly admitting that they couldn't explain it with geology. A rock reacts to its environment, but 3i Atlas was ignoring it. It was ploughing through the solar system with a momentum that felt determined, unyielding. And as the astronomers watched this perfect clockwork motion, they realized that the stability wasn't just an anomaly, it was a prerequisite. Because if you're going to fire thrusters to correct your course, you first need to make sure you're not tumbling out of control. The spin was not the end of the mystery. It was the preparation for what was coming next. On November 12th, Sir Isaac Newton's third law of motion was quietly suspended in the vicinity of 3i Atlas. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. This is the bedrock of physics and the inescapable rule of space travel. When the high-gain antenna picked up the signature of massive gas jets erupting from the surface of the object, the astronomers braced for the wobble. In a natural comet, outgassing is a violent and chaotic process. Pockets of ice hit sunlight and explode, acting like uncontrolled rocket thrusters, firing at random angles, pushing the rock into a tumble. Imagine strapping a dozen fire extinguishers to a spinning boulder and opening the valves all at once. The result should be chaos. Under these conditions, the object should have entered a death spiral, tumbling wildly as the torque tore through its center of mass. But 3i Atlas did not flinch. The telemetry showed the jets firing with immense pressure, yet the rotational axis remained locked in that perfect 16-hour cycle. It absorbed the thrust without the recoil. This is akin to firing a shotgun while standing on ice and not sliding backward. It implies a counterforce, a stabilization mechanism hidden beneath the hull that we could not see. A natural object cannot choose to ignore physics. If gas pushes left, the rock must move right unless something else pushes back to keep it steady. This phenomenon is known in aerospace engineering as reaction control. It is how spacecraft maintain their orientation during maneuvers using small, precise bursts of thrusters to negate unwanted momentum. Seeing this behavior on a supposed comet sent a wave of disbelief through the observation teams. They checked the sensors for calibration errors, but the data held firm. The jets themselves were suspicious. Natural vents spray gas in wide, diffuse clouds that dissipate rapidly, but the spectral analysis of these plumes showed they were collimated. Tight, focused beams of matter shooting out in specific vectors like the exhaust of an engine. They were not leaking, they were firing. And the object was leaning into the thrust, using the energy not to spin but to stabilize its trajectory as it prepared for the closest approach to the sun. The implications were terrifying because they suggested a level of agency that stones simply do not possess. It was correcting its own drift, fighting the chaos of the solar wind with a calculated resistance. We have to stop calling them vents. Vents happen to a rock. Thrusters happen to a ship. The non-wobble was the final nail in the coffin of the natural comet theory because rocks do not fight against their own momentum. As the object steadied itself against the roar of its own exhaust, the world waited for NASA to announce a discovery. Instead, they announced a press conference. And the stage was set for the greatest act of gaslighting in scientific history. On November 19th, the 45-day blackout was scheduled to end at exactly 2 p.m. Eastern Time. The atmosphere surrounding the NASA press conference was electric, with a tension that felt less like a scientific announcement and more like a crisis briefing during a war. For weeks, the internet had been burning with speculation about the silence. Why had the data stopped? Why was the trajectory so perfect? Why was the object spinning like a machine? The agency had promised to open a window into other solar systems, a phrase that implied clarity, a phrase that promised a view. Millions of people tuned in expecting the moment of contact, expecting high-resolution photography that would finally resolve the 5-kilometre shadow into a solid, defined shape. We wanted to see the craters. We wanted to see the surface. We wanted to see the truth. But as the administrators took the podium, the mood in the room shifted from anticipation to confusion. The language was carefully sanitized, stripped of any excitement or alarm. They spoke in broad generalizations about comets being time capsules from the early universe. They talked about water vapor and carbon dating. It was a lecture on basic astronomy designed to bore the audience into submission. They were reciting a script that had been scrubbed of any reference to the anomalies that had kept the astronomical community awake for the last month. There was no mention of the missing iron found in the spectral analysis. No explanation for the rigid 16-hour mechanical rotation that defied gravity. No comment on the impossible lack of orbital wobble, despite the massive outgassing. And then came the reveal. The moment they unveiled the image that was supposed to justify 45 days of secrecy. A collective gasp of disappointment rippled through the live stream. It wasn't a revelation. It was an insult. On the screen was a fuzzy, indistinct blob of grey light that offered less detail than the amateur photos taken from backyard telescopes weeks ago. The disconnect was jarring. We possess satellites that can read a license plate from orbit, yet we were being asked to believe that the combined might of the Webb and Hubble telescopes could only produce a smear. This was not a technical limitation. This was a curated release. The press conference was not held to show us 3i Atlas. It was held to tell us to stop looking. By presenting such low-quality data, they were subtly reinforcing the narrative that there was nothing to see. Just a dirty snowball. Just a fuzzy rock. Nothing to worry about. But for those paying attention, the blandness of the presentation was the biggest red flag of all. You do not lock down data for 45 days just to release a blur. You do not hold a global press conference to announce that you found nothing. The event was a magician's trick, a sleight of hand designed to draw our eyes away from the raw data and toward the safe, comfortable narrative of a natural comet. They opened a window, but they kept the blinds closed, and as the cameras flashed and the scientists smiled, a disturbing realization settled in. This wasn't a discovery. This was a distraction. And if they were working this hard to make us look away, it meant that the thing hidden behind that blur was something we were never meant to see. The image that finally loaded onto the screens of millions of waiting viewers was not a photograph. It was a smear, a pixelated grey ghost floating in a sea of digital noise. After 45 days of silence and the mobilization of the most advanced optical instruments in human history, this was the result. A fuzzy, indistinct blob of light that offered absolutely zero surface detail. It looked less like scientific data and more like a glitch. To understand the magnitude of this insult, you have to look at the hardware involved. We spent $10 billion on the James Webb Space Telescope. A machine so precise it can detect the heat signature of a bumblebee on the Moon from a distance of nearly 400,000 kilometers. We have the Hubble Space Telescope, which gave us high-definition views of Pluto's heart from billions of miles away. 3i Atlas was right on our doorstep. It was passing through the inner solar system illuminated by the full glare of the sun. By all laws of optics and resolution, we should have been able to see craters. We should have seen ridges. We should have seen the texture of the hull. Instead, we were given an image that looked worse than the stacked exposures taken by amateur astronomers in their backyards using equipment bought online. This discrepancy is not a failure of technology. It is a manipulation of data. In the world of digital imaging, there is a process called downsampling. You take a high-resolution, sharp image, and you deliberately reduce the pixel count to obscure the fine details. It is a digital blurring tool used to hide faces in news reports or license plates in surveillance footage, or in this case, to hide geometry. If 3i Atlas was a natural rock, there would be no reason to degrade the image. A rock looks like a rock whether it is in 4K or 144p, but if the object had artificial features, if it had sharp right angles, if it had symmetrical plating, if it had a smooth reflective hull that did not look like ice, then the only way to maintain the comet narrative is to destroy the resolution. Ambiguity is the ultimate camouflage. By releasing a blur, NASA accomplished two things. They technically fulfilled their promise to release the data while simultaneously releasing nothing of value. They gave the public a Rorschach test. If you're told it is a comet and you look at a fuzzy blob, your brain fills in the gaps and sees a comet, but the raw file tells a different story. The histogram of the image suggests that the original data was sharp and that the blur was applied as a post-processing filter. This was a sanitized release, a safe version of reality curated for public consumption to prevent panic. When a $10 billion telescope performs worse than a department store camera, you're not looking at incompetence. You're looking at censorship. They blurred it because the truth was too sharp to show. And as the analysts tried to sharpen the image to find the edges of the object, they realized that the fuzziness was hiding the most dangerous secret of all. By the time the microphones were turned off, the official narrative had solidified into a chant. Natural, water-based, harmless. These three words became the mantra repeated by every spokesperson and printed in every headline across the globe, a calculated lullaby designed to sedate a public that was beginning to ask too many questions. The strategy was simple, but effective. Acknowledge the existence of 3i Atlas, but strip it of its mystery. They categorized it as a long-period comet, a dirty snowball from the Oort cloud that had simply wandered a bit too close to the sun. But to maintain this narrative, they had to perform a linguistic gymnastics act that bordered on the absurd. Every single anomaly that screamed artificiality was rebranded as a natural quirk. The rigid 16-hour rotation wasn't mechanical stabilization, it was just a highly regular inertial state. The lack of iron in the spectral analysis wasn't evidence of refined alloys, it was an exotic chemical differentiation. They used soft, vague language to blur the sharp edges of the data. In the lexicon of officialdom, unusual is the word they use when they mean impossible. The most egregious lie was found in the chemical charts. To support the comet theory, they needed water. Comets are defined by ice sublimating into gas. So they pointed to the hydrogen detection and declared it to be evidence of water breakup, but they ignored the other half of the equation. Water is H2O, 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen. The raw data showed a massive spike in hydrogen, but the oxygen levels were negligible. You cannot have water without the oxygen. They were looking at a hydrogen-rich exhaust plume and calling it steam. It is the scientific equivalent of seeing smoke and calling it fog. This cognitive dissonance created a fracture in the scientific community. On one side were the institutionally funded researchers bound by the press release. On the other were the independent analysts staring at the raw numbers in disbelief. They realized that the official model required too many coincidences to work. For 3i Atlas to be a natural comet, it had to be the only comet in history with no iron, the only comet with a perfect gyroscopic spin, the only comet that enters the ecliptic plane with 0 inclination, and the only comet that refuses to reflect light. That is not a theory. That is a wish. The mantra was effective for the general public. People went back to sleep believing the experts. But the data remained stubborn. It sat on the servers, defying the labels attached to it. If you find a pocket watch on the beach, you do not describe it as a metallic shell formation with rhythmic ticking anomalies. You call it a watch. NASA was looking at a mechanism and describing a rock. They were forcing a square peg into a round hole because the alternative was to admit that the peg was made of refined metal, and it was watching us back. On November 25th, the chemical model finally collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. While the headlines continued to push the comfortable narrative of a melting comet, the raw spectroscopy data painted a picture that was far more volatile. To claim 3i Atlas is a comet is to claim it is made of water ice, simple H2O. When ice melts in the vacuum of space, it breaks apart into a predictable ratio of hydrogen and oxygen under the ultraviolet light of the sun. It is a recipe as old as the universe. But the spectrograph reading from the object was not a recipe, it was a riddle. The sensors were flooded with hits for atomic hydrogen and carbon, but the oxygen line was practically silent. This is scientifically alarming, You cannot have water without oxygen, just like you cannot have a fire without heat. The presence of abundant hydrogen without its partner suggests that we are not looking at the sublimation of ice, we are looking at the breakdown of something much more complex. The chemistry points to the fracture of heavy molecular chains, long strings of hydrocarbons snapping apart under the intense radiation of the sun. In nature, these complex carbon chains are found in tar and sludge. In human industry, they are the fundamental building blocks of propellant. The plume trailing behind 3I Atlas was not steam, it was smog. It was the chemical signature of a volatile substance reacting to heat, not a frozen rock melting away. This distinction changes everything about our understanding of the object's behaviour. If it were venting steam, the jets would be chaotic and diffuse, spreading out into a coma. But if it is venting the byproducts of a hydrocarbon breakdown, it implies a reservoir, a contained supply of material that is being released. The scientists looked at the ratios and realised they matched the signature of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, a mouthful of a term that essentially means soot. But soot does not come from clean ice. It comes from burning. It comes from energy conversion. The Comet was leaving a trail that looked suspiciously like exhaust. And this explains why the object was accelerating without tumbling. If you boil a kettle, the steam goes everywhere. But if you ignite a fuel line, the energy is directed. The hydrogen spike wasn't a sign of water, it was a sign of leakage. We were watching a mechanism bleeding out its energy source as it struggled against the gravity of the sun. The official report called it anomalous outgassing. But anomaly is just a word we use when we're afraid to say the truth. We weren't watching a snowball melt. We were watching a fuel tank rupture, and if 3I Atlas is carrying fuel, then it wasn't formed in the random chaos of a nebula. It was filled, and that implies a factory. On December the 1st, the scientific community faced a binary choice that would define the future of astronomy forever. Either our fundamental understanding of how the universe builds matter is broken, or we are looking at something that the universe didn't build at all. The accumulation of anomalies regarding 3I Atlas had reached a critical mass that could no longer be contained by the Comet hypothesis. You can explain away the orbit as extreme luck. You can explain the mechanical spin as a 1 in a billion coincidence. But you cannot explain the materials. Nature is a messy builder. When a star system forms, it is a chaotic gravitational soup where everything mixes with everything else. Iron mixes with nickel. Water mixes with dust. Silicon mixes with carbon. The result is always a dirty hybrid, a heterogeneous lump of primordial leftovers like a cookie made of floor sweepings. But 3I Atlas is clean. It possesses a chemical purity that is alien to the concept of natural accretion. The segregation of elements we are seeing requires energy. It requires intent. It requires a process. In human terms, we call this refining. We take raw ore from the ground and we use blast furnaces and chemical baths to strip away the impurities, creating alloys that are stronger and more heat-resistant than the original stone. We do this in factories. We do this to build ships. To look at 3I Atlas and call it a comet is like looking at a titanium steel ingot found in the woods and calling it a rock just because it is sitting in the dirt. It ignores the blatant evidence of manufacture. The implications of this factory theory are staggering. It suggests that somewhere in the deep dark of the Milky Way, there is an industrial capacity capable of launching 5-kilometre wide structures into interstellar space. This is not a biological spore or a random drift. This is a package. A delivery sent across the void with a specific destination or a specific purpose. The darkness of the hull isn't just low albedo, it is camouflage paint. The shape isn't just a shard, it is a fuselage designed to cut through the interstellar medium. We have spent decades listening for radio signals, assuming that the first contact would be a phone call, but civilizations do not just broadcast, they build. And physics dictates that a physical probe is a far more efficient way to gather data than a radio wave that degrades over distance. A probe can carry sensors. A probe can survive billions of years waiting for a target. A probe can wait. The realization that 3I Atlas is a manufactured object shifts the question from what is it to who sent it. We are staring at a piece of technology that is likely older than our species and more advanced than our greatest achievements. And it is currently moving through our backyard with the indifference of a machine that has a job to do. The factory that built this did not build it to be admired, they built it to endure. And as we grapple with the reality of an industrial universe, a chilling thought begins to take root. Factories do not build just one unit. Mass production is the hallmark of industry. If this is a standard model probe sent out to scan habitable zones, then where are the others? And more importantly, who is reading the data it is collecting? If 3i Atlas had been moving just 10% faster, we never would have seen it. It would have been a streak of light too faint for our senses to register, a ghost passing through the room before we even turned our heads. This is the terrifying reality of the selection effect. Astronomers often comfort themselves with the idea that we only find what our instruments are tuned to detect, implying that the limitation is on our end. But in the case of this object, the logic flows in the opposite direction. It feels like the object was tuned to be found by our instruments. Consider the physics of interstellar travel. If a civilization has the technology to cross the void between stars, they likely have the capability to move at relativistic speeds close to the speed of light. An object moving at that velocity would be invisible to the Pan-STARRS telescope that discovered 3i Atlas. The light would smear across the CCD chip, leaving no usable data. But 3i Atlas was not moving at light speed. It was moving at exactly the right velocity to be flagged as an anomaly, but not ignored as noise. It slowed down. It pumped the brakes right at the edge of our solar system, dropping its speed to a range that our primitive technology could track. And then there is the angle. The sky is a sphere of 360 degrees. We have telescopes looking everywhere, but the vast majority of our high-precision assets are locked onto the ecliptic plane because that is where the planets are. That is where the action is. If 3i Atlas had entered from the galactic north or south, it would have passed unseen by the Hubble or the Webb. Instead, it chose the one corridor where humanity is constantly watching. It walked right down the middle of Main Street at high noon. This convergence of perfect speed and perfect positioning destroys the argument of randomness. A random rock does not know the limitations of human optics. A random rock does not know where we point our cameras. But a probe does. A probe programmed to make contact or to assess capabilities would behave exactly like this. It would enter the detection zone, it would slow to a readable velocity, and it would reflect just enough light to be noticed, but not enough to reveal its true shape. We dismissed it as a comet because it behaved calmly enough to fit our models. But that calmness was a performance. It mimicked the movement of natural debris just well enough to get close without triggering a military response. It walked like a duck and quacked like a duck, so we let it into the pond. But now that we see the metal beneath the feathers, the intent becomes chilling. The selection effect usually refers to the bias of the observer. But here it refers to the selection made by the visitor. It selected us. It selected the time. And it selected the method of its own discovery. This raises the question that haunts every astronomer staring at that flat trajectory. Was its visibility a mistake, a navigational error that exposed a covert watcher? Or was it an invitation? A deliberate wave from across the street designed to see if we were awake enough to wave back. On August 15, 1977, the Big Ear Radio Telescope in Ohio recorded a 72-second burst of radio waves that changed the history of CT forever. It was a narrow band signal so strong, so loud, and so impossible to explain as natural noise that the astronomer Jerry Eamon circled the alphanumeric code on the computer printout and wrote the word "wow" in red ink. For nearly 50 years, humanity has obsessively scanned that same spot in the constellation Sagittarius, waiting for a repeat transmission that never came. The phone rang once, and then the line went dead, leaving us with a generation of silence. But on December 5th, a researcher overlaying the orbital backtrack of 3i Atlas onto the celestial map noticed a chilling alignment that had been overlooked in the chaos of discovery. The object did not just come from deep space, it came from the exact same patch of sky as the WOW signal, specifically the star group Chi Sagittarii. In a universe that is 360 degrees wide, the odds of the most famous alien signal in history and the most anomalous physical object in history originating from the same sliver of the void are statistically zero, unless they are connected. This realization forces us to rethink the timeline of contact and the protocol of interstellar exploration. We always assumed that if aliens wanted to talk, they would keep calling until we answered. But But any advanced civilization knows the limitations of radio waves. Signals degrade over light years, becoming indistinguishable from background static. Signals get blocked by dust, and most importantly, signals cannot look back. So the logical protocol is a two-stage approach. First, you send a ping, a high-energy wake-up call moving at the speed of light to paint the target and see if anyone is listening. That was 1977. Then, you send the probe, a physical asset moving at subluminal speeds to go where the signal went and verify the data. That is 3i Atlas. The math supports this terrifying sequence. If a probe was launched at the same time as the signal but travelled at a fraction of the speed of light, the 48-year gap between the WOW signal and the arrival of 3i Atlas makes perfect sense. It is the lag time between the flash of lightning and the roll of thunder. The signal arrived instantly. The vessel took the slow road. This implies a level of long-term planning that is characteristic of a Type II civilization, capable of thinking in centuries rather than the election cycles. They are not just shouting into the void, they are mapping it. The silence of the WOW signal since 1977 wasn't because they stopped transmitting, it was because the transmission was just the doorbell. We spent half a century staring at the radio spectrum wondering why they didn't call back. We were looking for another wave when we should have been looking for a hull. The echoes of 1977 are no longer just data points on an old paper printout fading in a drawer. They are the prequel to the event happening right now in our solar system. The coordinate match transforms 3i Atlas from a random visitor into a targeted response. We didn't pick up the phone 48 years ago, so they decided to come knock on the door personally. And unlike a radio signal, you cannot turn off a 5-kilometre wide mountain of metal parked in your driveway. On December 10th, the massive dish of the Green Bank telescope swung toward the coordinates of 3i Atlas, listening for a whisper from the void. We were hoping for a greeting. A stream of prime numbers, or a burst of telemetry that would confirm the artificial nature of the object once and for all. But the headphones remained silent. The official report stated that the object was emitting less radio energy than a standard cell phone. To the public, this was presented as proof that the object was a dead rock, a cold inert stone tumbling through the dark with no internal electronics to speak of. But this conclusion suffers from a fatal anthropomorphic bias. We assume that because we are noisy neighbours, everyone else must be noisy too. We blast our television signals and radar waves into the cosmos like a lighthouse sweeping the ocean. But a lighthouse is not a strategy, it is a warning. If 3i Atlas is a reconnaissance probe, its mission is not to announce its presence. Its mission is to gather intelligence. And the first rule of intelligence gathering is silence. Consider a stealth aircraft penetrating enemy airspace. It does not fly with its transponder on. It does not broadcast its flight plan. It operates in passive mode, absorbing radar waves and mapping the terrain without emitting a single photon of its own. The lack of a signal from 3i Atlas is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of discipline. Furthermore, the upper limit of the scan is telling. By saying it emits less than a cell phone, they are admitting that low-power transmission is still possible. An advanced civilization would not use omnidirectional radio waves that waste energy in all directions like a lantern. They would use tight beam laser communication, a needle of light aimed directly back at their home star. Such a signal would be invisible to us unless we were standing directly in the line of fire, which we are not. So while we listen for a beep, 3i Atlas is likely soaking up everything we're throwing at it. It is swimming in our radio leakage, recording our military radar frequencies, analysing our atmospheric composition, mapping our satellite networks. It doesn't need to ask us who we are because we have been shouting our identity into space for 100 years. A silent guest at the dinner table observes more than the loud one. The fact that it is not transmitting is the most unsettling data point of all. Noise implies carelessness. Silence implies intent. We shouldn't be relieved that the radio telescopes found nothing. We should be terrified. Because in the dark forest of the universe, the predator does not roar before it strikes. It isn't talking to us because it doesn't need to. It isn't talking because it is listening. On December 19th, 3rd Atlas reached the point of maximum peril, known as perihelion grazing the surface of the Sun at a distance that should have vaporized it instantly. This region of space is known to astronomers as the graveyard of comets. It is the thermal incinerator where dirty snowballs like the famous Comet Ison are stripped of their ice, and disintegrated into dust by the raw fury of the solar corona. We watched the telemetry with bated breath, expecting the sensors to register a sudden debris cloud marking the death of the anomaly. We expected it to crack. We expected it to boil. But 3I Atlas did not die. It did not fracture. It did not fade. Instead, it performed a maneuver that is the hallmark of advanced spaceflight, utilizing a phenomenon known in orbital mechanics as the Oberth effect. By falling deep into the gravitational potential of the Sun and firing its stabilizers at the exact moment of closest approach, an object can steal momentum from the star itself, turning a passive fall into a hypervelocity slingshot. A natural rock simply falls and swings back out, losing energy to friction and tidal forces like a ball rolling up a hill. But 3I Atlas emerged from the solar corona moving faster than it entered. It picked up speed. It tightened its arc. It hardened its trajectory against the solar wind. This was not a random encounter with gravity. This was a theft. We use gravity assist for our own Voyager probes to sling them toward the outer planets, but those maneuvers require precise mathematical calculation and active guidance. To see a 5-kilometer wide object execute such a perfect turn without disintegrating implies a structural integrity that defies our understanding of natural materials. The heat at perihelion is enough to melt steel and vaporize silicate rock. Yet the object's albedo remained constant, suggesting its hull was designed to absorb or deflect that thermal punishment. The survival of 3I Atlas at this range proves definitively that it's not a loose collection of rubble held together by weak gravity. It is a monolith, a single solid structure capable of withstanding the hammer of God, and its interaction with the Sun was not an accident of orbit but a calculated pit stop. It dipped into the gravity well not to die but to recharge, to gather the kinetic energy required to leave our system as quickly as it arrived. It treated the centre of our solar system not as a star to be orbited but as a battery to be drained. As it slingshotted back out toward the cold dark of the outer planets, leaving the stunned scientists to stare at the impossible velocity numbers, a chilling realization took hold. It didn't just pass through, it used our Sun as a refueling station. On January 14th, the redshift telemetry confirmed what the optimists had refused to believe. 3I Atlas was not slowing down to enter orbit, nor was it turning to communicate. It was leaving, accelerating out of the gravity well with a hyperbolic excess velocity that made interception impossible. The departure was as precise and mechanical as the arrival. Having siphoned the necessary momentum from the Sun, the object adjusted its vector and pointed its nose toward the dark gap between the constellations. There is a profound sense of rejection in this exit. Humanity spent months in a frenzy of observation, debating protocols for first contact and preparing our messages for the visitor. We turned every eye on the planet toward the ecliptic plane, hoping for a nod, a wave, a sign of recognition. But 3I Atlas treated Earth with the total indifference of a camera recording a landscape. It did not care about our politics or our panic. It did not react to our radar pings. It simply moved through the room, took the pictures it needed, and walked out the back door without saying goodbye. As the object fades from visual magnitude, leaving the inner solar system behind, it takes the answers with it. We are left standing on the porch watching the taillights fade into the night. The acceleration suggests it is in a hurry, not fleeing from a threat but rushing toward a deadline. The data it collected during its brief transit is now stored in its core. It possesses the spectral map of our atmosphere, proving we have oxygen and industry. It has the leakage of our radio waves, proving we have communication. It has the location of our orbital defences. All of this information is moving away from us at 30 kilometers per second. The silence it leaves behind is different now. Before it arrived, the silence was empty. Now it is pregnant with implication. We know it isn't just a rock drifting aimlessly. We know it has a destination. And most terrifying of all, we know that it finished exactly what it came here to do. It didn't leave because it was bored. It left because the job was done. The files are compiled. The upload is prepared. And as 3I Atlas vanishes into the deep freeze of the outer solar system, one final chilling thought resonates through the control rooms. The scan is complete. On January 20th, the Materials Science Division quietly circulated a memo that recontextualized everything we thought we knew about the object's composition. When 3I Atlas first appeared, the detection of pure nickel was treated as a geological puzzle, a weird quirk of a distant solar system that produced metal-rich asteroids. But after watching the object survive a suicidal dive through the solar corona, the nickel takes on a very different and much more functional meaning. In the periodic table of elements, nickel is not just a metal, it is a shield. Here on Earth, when we build machines that need to survive the hellish temperatures of a jet turbine, or the core of a nuclear reactor, we do not use iron. We use nickel-based superalloys. Materials like Inconel and Hastelloy. These are synthetic compounds engineered specifically to resist thermal creep and oxidation at extreme temperatures, where other metals would liquefy. Iron softens when it gets hot, losing its structural integrity like wax. Rock fractures and explodes under thermal stress. Ice vaporizes instantly. But nickel holds the line. The fact that 3I Atlas is composed of this specific material explains the impossible physics of its survival during perihelion. A natural comet passing that close to the Sun would have been subjected to thermal shock capable of tearing it apart. The rapid heating of the surface versus the cold interior creates massive structural stress that shatters stone. This is why comets like Ison disintegrate into dust when they get too close. But 3I Atlas did not crack because it was plated. The data suggest we are not looking at a solid block of metal, but rather a hull. A protective skin designed to absorb the punishment of a star and protect the delicate internal systems hidden within. The missing iron is no longer a mystery, it is a feature. Iron is heavy and corrosive. If you are building an interstellar probe where every gram of mass matters and durability is paramount, you refine the iron out. You leave only the heat-resistant nickel lattice to act as armor. This implies a level of metallurgy that rivals or exceeds our own. We are looking at the product of an industrial process that understands thermodynamics better than nature does. The silence from the astronomical community regarding this connection is telling. To admit that the object is made of aerospace-grade shielding is to admit that it is a craft. It forces us to abandon the comforting delusion of the dirty snowball. Snowballs melt, machines endure. The resilience of 3I Atlas was not a miracle of geology, it was a triumph of engineering. It flew through the fire and came out the other side unscathed not because it was lucky, but because it was shielded. It refused to burn because it was built to survive. On November 22nd, the illusion of transparency finally shattered. The public realization that the blurry image of 3I Atlas was not a mistake, but a choice, hit the scientific community like a shockwave. For days, independent analysts had been deconstructing the digital noise of the released photo, hoping to find a hidden detail in the static. But what they found was evidence of erasure. The histogram of the image showed unmistakable signs of artificial downsampling. This means the original file was sharp. It means that somewhere in the chain of custody, between the James Webb Telescope and the public press release, a decision was made to degrade the resolution. This is not just a technical grievance. It is a violation of the unwritten contract between science and the public. We build these billion-dollar instruments with tax money under the promise that they will expand our view of the universe. Yet when that view becomes too challenging, the blinds are pulled shut. The gap between what the sensors saw and what we were shown has created a permanent fracture in trust. It forces us to question every other safe explanation we have been fed. If they are willing to blur the image of a 5-kilometer-wide object to maintain the Comet narrative, what else are they hiding? The trust deficit is compounded by the capability of the hardware. We know what the Webb telescope can do. We have seen it image the swirls of dust in galaxies billions of light years away with pinpoint clarity. To claim that it could not resolve the shape of a massive solid object inside our own solar system is an insult to the engineers who built it. It is a lie so transparent that it reveals the desperation behind it. They were afraid of the panic that a clear image might cause, afraid of the theological and sociological collapse that comes with the confirmation of non-human intelligence. So they chose the blur. They chose to present a version of reality that was soft and digestible. But in doing so, they lost the one thing that science requires to function: credibility. The fuzzy image was not a limitation of optics, it was a limitation of courage. And now, as the object moves away into the darkness carrying its secrets with it, we are left with a haunting certainty. A raw high-definition file exists. On a secure server in a windowless room, there is a picture of 3i Atlas that shows the hull. That shows the plating. That shows the truth. And the fact that they would rather destroy their own credibility than let us see it tells us one thing. The content of that file is not just scientific. It is transformative. We know they're lying about the resolution. The only question left is what exactly does the raw file look like that makes it so dangerous to show? On January 30th, the scientific community quietly crossed a threshold from which there is no return. The departure of 3i Atlas marked the death of the lonely universe theory. For centuries, humanity has clung to the comforting belief that the cosmos is a silent wilderness composed of dead rocks and burning gas. We believed that if life existed elsewhere, it was likely microbial or primitive sludge clinging to a wet rock, waiting to be discovered by our benevolent curiosity. But the visitor proved that the universe is not just evolving biological matter, it is manufacturing technological matter. To look at the trajectory and composition of that object and call it natural is no longer scientific conservatism. It is denial. We have been visited by a product, a package sent through the dark by a sender who understands physics better than we do. This realization transforms the night sky from a landscape into a seascape. It is no longer empty. It is trafficked. The anomaly of the missing iron and the mechanical spin are not just puzzles to be solved. They are signatures of intent. Someone mined that nickel from the core of a dead asteroid. Someone refined it in a furnace hot enough to simulate a star. Someone launched it with a mathematical precision that accounts for the gravity of planets light years away. We are looking at a logistics network operating on a galactic scale where probes are dispatched like seeds in the wind. The psychological impact of this awakening is shattering. We are like an isolated tribe on a remote island who just saw a drone fly over the tree line for the first time. We did not build it. We do not know how it flies. But we know definitively that it is not a bird. Our models of star formation are broken because they fail to account for the variable of intelligence. Intelligence rearranges matter. Intelligence ignores gravity. And now we know that intelligence is operating in our solar system. The silence of the void is a lie. It is full of traffic we're just too primitive to see. As we look up at the stars tonight, the feeling is no longer one of solitude but of exposure. We opened our eyes thinking we were alone in a dark room only to realize the room is crowded. The universe is not sleeping. We are not the only ones awake. On February 14th, the final telemetry packet from 3i Atlas flickered and died. The object crossed the invisible threshold of our sensor capabilities, vanishing back into the deep freeze of the Kuiper belt as silently as it arrived. There was no fanfare, no grand departure signal, just a fading ghost on a monitor that eventually turned to static. But while the object is gone, it has left a vacuum in its wake that no amount of official denial can fill. We are left staring at a set of data points that physics cannot reconcile, the perfect entry along the ecliptic plane. The mechanical 16-hour spin, the impossible nickel plating that refused to burn. These are not errors in the data, they are footprints. The official narrative will try to bury 3i Atlas in the archives of unsolved anomalies, alongside the WOW signal and the Tabby's star fluctuations. They will file it away as a curiosity to be forgotten. But for those of us who watch the raw feed, the conclusion is inescapable. We failed the test. This visitor was a stress test of our planetary awareness. It entered our home in broad daylight, used our sun to refuel and mapped our capabilities, while we argued over whether it was a rock or a machine. We hesitated. We blurred the images. We looked for comfort instead of truth. The departure of 3i Atlas is not an end. It is an intermission. If the factory theory is correct, then this was likely a standard model probe, unit number 3 or 3000. It has completed its circuit and is now carrying a full biological and technological profile of Earth back to its point of origin. The data upload will take time to cross the void, but it will arrive. And when it does, the senders will know that the third planet from the star is occupied. They will know that we have radar. They will know that we have nuclear capacity. And they will know that we are suspicious. The window into other solar systems that NASA promised has been opened, but it works both ways. We looked out, but something looked in. The silence that settles over the observatories tonight is heavy with a new kind of dread. It is the silence of waiting for the second shoe to drop. Because logistical networks do not send just one truck, reconnaissance is always followed by something else. 3i Atlas was the scout. It came to verify the signal from 1977. Now that verification is complete, the cycle has advanced. As we turn our telescopes back to the empty dark, scanning for the next anomaly, we do so with the terrifying knowledge that the element of surprise is gone. We are no longer hidden in the noise of the galaxy. We have been found, we have been scanned, and the next visitor will not need to slow down to see if we are home. They know where we are now, and they know we are watching.